to a grounded cosmic experience in service of expanding our consciousness and awareness surrounding rigor and astrology through listening with an open mind and heart. And may we open the space with clarity and insight into one another and all that will be disclosed today.
Thank you. And I just wanted to say thank you, everybody, for showing up. This is, I think, the third formal meeting of Funimkyo. And I'm going to be dropping to halftime next semester, so I'll have more time to give to this endeavor, and that means more opportunities to get together. So I encourage anyone who's not on the email list to put your name on it, which is over there on the table with the goodies. And whether or not you know, you can come to meetings. I try to send out additional information. So if you're just interested in astrology, you might be interested in the list. And we're going to be doing things like planning a forum or an event related to astrology here at CIIS. There's interest in that. And planning a trip to the planetarium for astronomical understanding. A lot of interest in that. So I guess I'll introduce our speaker, who really doesn't need an introduction. We know Rick Tarnas. I've asked him to please speak about the concept of rigor in astrology and what does that mean in such a Uranian maverick tradition. It's such a qualitative as opposed to a quantitative science and an art. And it frustrates attempts at reductionism and certainly laughs at reductionism. So maybe we could also hear what sets archetypal astrology apart from other traditions.
What's the morphing field here for your previous groups of people been sitting down? I'm totally comfortable.
Standing, I mean, I've been standing.
I'm just seeing.
It's not very rigorous to sit down.
You know, the truth is, I tend to speak better on my feet. There's some energetic thing that happens. It's not, I can think fine when I'm writing either way, but there's something about the extra level of extroverted force that has to happen to go from in here out there that somehow standing helps me. So, thank you, Artemis, for the invitation and for the good topic that you asked me to talk about. And thank you for welcoming me here. Many of you, of course, I know well from our classes together, but others are new to me here. So, rigor in astrology is such an important topic. And in a sense, it reminds me, the word reminds me right away of the very first talk that was given at this series of what I think I called it like the Tuesday night group at Esalen about, it was 30 years ago. This right, exactly. There were a number of people who were pretty, intellectually creative and cutting edge. And who were living at Esalen at the time. And I asked Gregory Bateson, who was there during the last 2 years of his life, living up at Fritz Perl's house, if he would give the opening talk of what I conceive to be every Tuesday night, a gathering of this group talking about any topic that we found of interest. And he embraced the opportunity. We did it quite well, but that opening night, his suggestion for the title was Rigor and Imagination, which brings us right to the heart of the specific challenge that astrology presents to us, because rigor and imagination is precisely, you need to basically have equal equal access to, equal developed competencies in each of those directions. And I totally agree with Artemis's starting point about the astrological calling or discipline or perspective, tradition. It's so Uranian. And it's also a very Neptunian tradition. It's a Neptunian perspective. It draws on the human capacity for the imaginative, intuitive, archetypal discernment, a capacity to basically, and when it comes down to why astrology is so challenging to introduce rigor into its epistemology, is the fact that really we're dealing with gods. And you don't put gods into a quantitative double-blind study and expect to come out with anything like the dance that they're doing. They're laughing as you do that kind of a study, and eluding the crude tools that are being deployed by such an approach. But the fact that it's difficult is not a reason to, I'm just turning off my cell phone so that I embarrass myself. The fact that this is a specific challenge that astrology has perhaps as potently as any study I can think of, even more than psychology. Psychology's got its challenges, but astrology is like psychology with the added level of this divinatory and imaginative archetypal dimension so prominent. So, despite the fact that it's challenging, it's a very, very important task to address the issue of rigor. One, it's important for the future of the field because there's no way that astrology is going to move back into the center of culture where it belongs and where it was, and back to the center of a culture, a civilization's reflections that really needs it. The level of that was actually the impetus that really pushed me right after 9/11 to, I wrote out the lecture that I gave on the Saturn-Pluto cycle, that like the day after it happened for the class that should have met on September 11th. And it was as a result of writing that out that it then got spread around the internet, and editors read it and publishers read it in New York, and then they contacted me or my literary agent who had done Passion of the Western Mind for me as an agent. They wanted it published as the book that lecture represented. And I know that the reason that something clicked in me right at the time of September 11th is that I felt that this was a perspective that was so crucial for the collective psyche to have available to among other things, illuminate its shadow, which the Saturn-Pluto cycle has a tendency to constellate in the classic Jungian sense on a collective level. So kind of gravitas came into the task. It wasn't just a matter of writing a book for increased psychological awareness for individuals. There's also a level of just what Jung says in that sentence that I quote from a letter of his, where he says, we have not yet understood that the discovery of the unconscious represents a great spiritual task that must be accomplished if our civilization is to survive. So anyway, that's the background of the importance of astrology generally, but to bring in rigor is crucial to allow it to move into into an accepted place within the discourse of our high culture and academic milieu, so that the critical intelligence that was painstakingly evolved over the last 1,000 years, just to take the European-American situation, but really it's especially the kind of critical intelligence that was very strongly developed after the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. We need to use that level of intelligence, of critical analysis, and wed it to the profundity of psycho-spiritual, archetypal, imaginative understanding that it's a kind of solar-lunar conjunctio, to use the term of our this society's title. And for astrology's own dignity and responsibility, we need to bring in rigor. And we also, I think, and this is probably the bottom line, we need to have rigor for our own sake, and that of, if any of us see clients or share our insights with our friends or family, if one doesn't have rigor, if one doesn't have a certain self-critical awareness of how one is speaking about these mysteries, there is a great danger of stating things with all the authority that comes from the numinous dimension of the cosmos. Like an astrologer or somebody who's speaking about, well, this is what this chart, what I see in this chart. The astrologer is carrying a certain numinous authority. A transference happens, much as like it happens with a priest or a priestess in a religious context. You're in some ways seen as an interpreter of the divine will, of the cosmic mystery of the cosmic intelligence. And if in that role, in the guise of that authority, you then say something that really represents an ad hoc assumption that you somehow unthinkingly picked up or inherited along the way, or just came up with oneself on an inadequate basis, and then make a concrete prediction out of that assumption, that shapes the life of the person that you talk to, or it shapes your own life if you're reading your own transits or natal chart or relationship through the lens of this, through the distorting lens of this assumption. So, for one's own sake, one needs to have adequate rigor in the astrological act. In a sense, this comes down to a point that we'll be developing more in the course of our time here this evening, and that is, it's the very nature of the underlying astrological principles that we're working with, the principles of meaning. It's essential to those principles of meaning that they are multivalent. That is, that they have multiple ways of concretely expressing themselves while remaining true to their essence, to their dynamic, spiritual, creative, multi-potential essence. And it's precisely that archetypal multivalence that gives human autonomy its purchase. if you could read a chart and say, this is the way it's going to be, or this is what's going to happen to me or to you, or to the world, that's fate. That's the end of autonomy. There's a determinism in there, and a concrete linear mode of understanding that, to my best judgment, after 30 whatever years of intensive studying of this mystery, to my judgment, that's a deep misunderstanding of the astrological mystery, and that astrology really is archetypally predictive. It's not concretely predictive. And that, in turn, supports the underlying creative freedom of the cosmos as well as of the human being. Because the cosmos seems able to respond to our own, our level of consciousness, to how we act at any given moment. The cosmos seems to reconfigure its ways of expressing what was already set in motion according to how we act, how we think, how we perceive, and the kind of energy we bring into the situation. It reminds me of those GPS devices when I was in the Netherlands the other day, when I did, where the person who was driving me to my lecture one morning to all these government agency young leaders, and it was, I had to be on time at a fairly distant place in the Netherlands, and moving from here to here, because there had been a big accident on the main freeway. Thousands and thousands of drivers were going out of the main freeway, where it was blocked for 15 miles straight, and going out into all the villages and towns and all these other towns. So as my driver was making his way from point A to point B, every time he turned, the GPS device would say, recalculating or recalibrating, something like that, and then all the directions would suddenly shift. Everything was going like this, the red lines, and the number of minutes until destination would be reached. All this was completely shifted in a split second by the computer, and then he might 30 seconds later make a right-hand turn, and everything's shifted again, recalculating. The voice comes over and that's what the cosmos seems to be doing with us all the time. We take a left turn rather than a right turn in our life. Oh, you're going to do that, says the cosmos, and then responds in a creative way that is somehow appropriate to that action. So there's something about what the astrological perspective that requires an awareness of this dialogically unfolding reality that is our human condition. And this, by preserving a sense of archetypal multivalence, that is the fact that the astrological, the position of that planet in your chart, or those aspects, this transit can express itself in a number of ways, and in fact, in a virtually unlimited number of ways, all of which nevertheless reflect the God, the archetypal complex, in all its creative multiplicity. And so if we're adequately aware of this, it gives us simultaneously a sense for which way the wind's blowing, or which ways the winds are blowing, a greater sort of capacity to respond intelligently to what's happening, but at the same time it preserves the creative autonomy of the universe, and it honors these powerful, I think of them as like chordal structures that the archetypal principles represent in the music of our lives. The big, powerful, A major chord followed by a C sharp minor, and everything shifts as it moves from A major to C sharp minor. But the melody we decide to sing to that chordal shift, or the dance that we dance to it, is to a great extent part of our own responsibility. So this approach, one that honors this multivalence, it requires a certain self-aware critical rigor to not fall into some single, literal, simplistic interpretation of a given astrological factor and think that is the meaning of that factor rather than a potential way in which that factor can express itself. And that frees us from the kind of fatalistic delusion that is in some ways the shadow of astrology, and it's a shadow in the human mind's way of thinking about life. Theologians who deal with the omnipotence of the divine will run into the same issue. Scientists who think about the omnipotence of genetic factors or Newtonian forces have each at different times gotten into a deterministic frame of reference. Now, as to how rigor has been, what place it has held in the history of astrology, it's really been notoriously insufficiently present. And I think in the contemporary world, it's quite, as astrology is widely practiced, the rigor really isn't there. And we're really needing to bring in a far greater degree of clarity, of self-awareness, of the virtues of mind that all of you who are associated with a graduate school have been cultivating for your entire academic career. In a way, this comes down to there's that famous distinction between the hermeneutics of trust versus the hermeneutics of suspicion. I think it was Paul Rigor who brought that distinction into our conversation. So the hermeneutics of suspicion, that would be like Freud and Marx and Nietzsche, and basically it's questioning what's really going on here. This person thinks that they're doing something because of this, but it could be economic. They could be saying that they have this ideal and that's why they're doing this thing, but Marx reveals what's really happening under here is socioeconomic power interest, or Foucault would be another one thinking that way. Or for Nietzsche, it's the will to power that would be often operative behind our high ideals. Or for Freud, it would be the libidinal unconscious is driving the show. Each of these are interpreters, that is, they're employing a hermeneutics, a mode of interpretation that is suspicious of what the surface is suggesting, or what the person is thinking that why they're doing something. But the hermeneutics of trust, Rigor said, we've so highly developed the hermeneutics of suspicion but we need a hermeneutics of trust. I make this argument, for example, in relationship to the cosmos itself, that the modern mind has become so suspicious of our projecting our need for meaning onto anything, and projecting our meanings onto anything, that it has created the bottom line conviction that the universe in itself is meaningless. And it doesn't recognize that that too is either a projection or a potential projection. So in a sense, this is a hermeneutics of suspicion that hasn't adequately turned the lens of suspicion on its own posture of suspicion. And that's the postmodern mind's plight right there. But a hermeneutics of trust would give the open up the possibility that we are having that the universe is capable of carrying meanings and purposes that may be intelligible to us, and that it may actually in some ways be seeking to communicate from its interior to our interior, with which it is congruent. That takes an act of trust that we live in a meaningful cosmos, and that the depths of the human being are coherent with the depths of the cosmos. So it's a balance between the two. But if you just have the hermeneutics of trust and you don't balance it out with the hermeneutics of suspicion, then you get the lack of rigor. Then you get, whatever I see, whatever my intuition tells me, or as George W. Bush would say, whatever my gut tells me, that's what's real. That's the shadow side of the hermeneutics of trust. So we need both. One more point about the difficulty of the task, and then let's go right into the task of and the strategies for practical strategies for deploying an authentically, fruitfully rigorous approach to astrology. One of the big difficulties is certainly that there are so many factors involved in astrological analysis. The sheer multiplicity and complexity of factors that one takes into account in astrology makes it difficult to be adequately rigorous, because one can, this is a real problem if you read typical articles in popular astrological magazines. They will be bringing in so many factors about the midpoint of Juno and the vertex and the progressed Chiron in the fifth harmonic chart is doing this. And I mean, once you start bringing in enough factors, you can explain away anything, or you can explain anything. And so the only way one can be adequately rigorous is if you rein in the sheer multiplicity of factors and seek to see if there is a particular set of factors that you can observe carefully in a wide enough range of circumstances and in a sufficient number of cases that you can get a sense for, this is a pattern. But if you can bring in thousands of factors for any given, to explain any given event, then there is no limit to your ability to explain things and explain away things, and there's no disciplining restraint on being able to check whether this really is a factor to weigh. A second big difficulty is the resistance to statistical prediction. it's just the very nature of archetypes. I think it comes down to that as much as anything else. Archetypes are so richly multivalent. Jung has written beautifully about it. Hillman has. While there has been some statistical research that's been done with very interesting results, the Gold-Clement research, it's so minuscule a result compared with the richness of the reality of astrological correlations, that it's like a kind of, it's such a crude instrument. It's like trying to play Beethoven's violin sonata with a sledgehammer. It just doesn't, do the job. The music is there, waiting to be heard, to be experienced, and we really need a sufficiently supple, sensitive, really a multiple intelligence, a multiple faculty approach to the act of astrological understanding in order to register it, in order to hear this music. And this, therefore, requires a cultivation of the capacity for archetypal discernment, what James Hillman calls the archetypal eye. And he says the archetypal eye is not something that can be developed simply like in the psychological, psychotherapeutic context. It can't be developed simply by studying case histories. It requires a deep study, this is still Hillman speaking, deep study of history, of culture, of biography, of the arts, of ideas, and the history of ideas. This is where the capacity for archetypal discernment develops. And what's remarkable is even Aristotle, not one you immediately think of as being tuned into this dimension, but it was he who, I came across a passage in the Poetics the other day where he says, the quote in English translation, "The greatest thing by far is to be a master of metaphor." Archetypes are essentially, they're metaphors, in the capacity to recognize the archetypal patterning that unites the contraction of a birth contraction with the hard labor of bringing forth a play where everybody's pulling together and working hard to get that initial performance all born. That takes to be able to see, these are both birth contractions. These are both Saturn principles of contraction, of discipline, of hard work, of effort, of sort of serious, purposeful, focused action. To recognize the metaphor that's at work, uniting the two very different activities, that takes a form of understanding. And Aristotle says it is the metaphorical understanding is the one thing that cannot be learned from others. It says a good metaphor implies an intuitive perception of the similarity in dissimilars. So even he was grasping this. I've come across a passage years ago from Robert Frost about how a good poet has to know how to experience and deploy metaphors and how far it can be taken. So, but that's the remarkable thing about astrology. Of all the sciences, it's the one that is also totally an art. It's an art and a science. It requires the mathematical precision of the scientist and the archetypal, imaginative, metaphoric soul of a poet, and one needs both of those in a synthesis, not as separate realities, but as a synthesis. Okay, so now for some practical strategies, and then I'd like to open it up to discussion, both because I know there's people in the room who are very excellent practicing astrologers and know can speak with experience and authority about this, but also because others of you will either have questions or insights of your own to share. First, if you're at the beginning of this path, or really anywhere along the path of the first, let's say, the first years of study, one really has to be learning, taking in the tradition one way or another in order to get a sense for what the paradigm is. Every scientist needs this. One needs to learn the craft. One needs to learn the discipline, and that because, however, there is so much unrigorous and questionable and quaintly bizarre writing and teaching in astrology, it's really important to choose your teachers and your books that you're going to learn from. You have to choose those really carefully. Once you've found a trustworthy source of insight, then you really want to take that in deeply. The books that you find that you've really you have the sense that this is a trustworthy intelligence, that this person is not just spouting out keywords that they learned from somebody else, but that they've done a lot of research. There's a certain tentativeness to how they're presenting it. They're not with this kind of absolute, literal, predictive dogmatism that can immediately tell us that this is not a person that we are going to get the deepest insights from, and that we should trust at a deep level. Once you've found somebody that either a book or an author or a teacher, that you really get the sense that this person is trustworthy, then go deep in that directly. Read that text several times. Really take it in. Take it in until you pretty much know it by heart. Knowing it, though, at the same time that one is always testing it, looking at the you're basically taking the principles that you're learning and then checking. Now, your own chart is going to be the first point of empirical testing, because you know yourself better than you know anything else. Our self-knowledge isn't perfect, obviously, but we do have a direct grasp of the quality of our experience in a way that no one from the outside can match, and more than anything that we will know about anybody else's lives. So studying your own chart really, really carefully, and then your own life and all the transits in your life, all the major experiences that you've been through in your life, checking out what transits did you have during those experiences. That's the initial point of building a solid foundation. Then branching out to study those that you know well, you know their lives well, and then going into famous individuals that you have a knowledge of. So you're constantly testing the authority and the pronouncements and the principles that you're learning from these trustworthy sources, and you have to simultaneously take them in a trusting way sufficiently to be able to check out the using them as the lens. You have to trust the telescope enough to put it up and look. But at the same time, one needs to be never just taking things for granted, and because it can obscure our perception. Thomas Kuhn, the author of The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, makes this point very clearly when he talks about how for science to progress, you need to have an accepted structure of assumptions and practices that have been tested and shared and taught in an education that he says in some ways is like dogmatic theology. And that sets up a productive, he calls that normal science. And that normal science requires a paradigm to work. And we need to have taken in the tradition. We need to have taken in the paradigm to be able to do anything at all. I don't know anybody that can just look at a chart without any study of texts or having learned something from another astrologer, and who can just start making conclusions, unless they're, suddenly become a channel of some, discarnate astrologer from 8th century BCE in Mesopotamia. Chances are that it reminds me of what Karl Popper said, making this point in the area of philosophy of science. He would sometimes say to his students in the philosophy of science classes in the UK, he'd say, observe. And then he would talk to them later about how they fulfilled his injunction. And because there was no paradigm to work within, there was nothing fruitful. They needed to have to observe, they needed to have a structure of principles and assumptions that could permit a fruitful act of cognition. And so we need to do that, but always testing them. And here's the important point is not just in one case, and not just on two, but many, many, many. So that this is a problem in psychoanalysis too. I remember there was once there's a joke actually in psychoanalytic circles where they would say, as a rule of thumb, never write a paper and pronounce a theory on the basis of one case history. On the basis of one case, you need at least two. And that seems like very funny, but the fact of the matter is that's just, Freud basically started on, he had himself, and then one or two very interesting cases, and then suddenly a whole theory comes out of it. And the fact of the matter is that can be enough to get a very fruitful paradigm going, and then you start refining it, modifying it, and so forth. Because a lot of times the universe speaks to us through a very powerful single case history. But at the same time, you really have to watch out for that tendency to project into the universal what one particular case is. Just because one person's father died when Saturn was going through somebody's 10th house doesn't mean everybody's father's going to die when Saturn goes through people's 10th houses. And so really, you want to... I noticed that a lot of times astrologers will make general statements because they haven't seen enough cases. I'll give an example. A woman came up to me in 1992, a very touching, moving example at the Archetypal Psychology Festival in Notre Dame. And she knew that I knew astrology. And she told me that an astrologer had told her that she could never have, or should never have children because she had a particular position, Pluto, in a particular house. And I was just so really like angry with anybody that would say that, and I knew so well how that was not a valid principle, and I was able to just very quickly go in my own mind all the people that I knew had Pluto in that house and who had children that were wonderful and so forth. And so I could just tell her right away, because I had that database in my mind to just relieve her of that fear. Her problem was that she didn't know enough astrology, so she only had one history to deal with, one case, and she'd been told this, and so she was in the state of wounded frozenness. And the person who gave that rule to her, I mean, they could have done nothing more than having, well, this is, Pluto is the destroyer, and this house is the house of children, or something like that. And they put them together. You bet. Honestly, astrologers make those kinds of blanket statements, and it's incredibly destructive, and it's incredibly not rigorous. There has to. This is why I really think the modern self, modern civilization, had to reject astrology. It had to, in order to emancipate itself from this background of a fatalistic determinism that was the shadow. It wasn't the whole of astrology, ancient and medieval astrology, but it was the continuing shadow of it, and it was real, and it's still there in how astrologers, some astrologers, pursue their practice, and this was a case of it right there. I think it's for those of you who have gotten to the point where you are writing about astrology or you're teaching it, and you want to say that this is, like, here is a principle. This is something I have observed. This is a correlation that is a significant correlation that is worth being aware of as a consistent patterning. And when you get to that place, then first of all, it's really important when you're, like, if you're giving a reading or you're asked about, well, what does this mean? It's important to say, okay, this is what I have observed. I can say this with confidence. Right? Or to say, I'm not as familiar with that particular issue or correlation that is widely regarded in the textbooks. I have read it in the text. This is what the tradition says, or this is what the conventional astrological belief is. I don't have that empirical experience myself to say that. That's important to say. It gives the person hearing, or if you're writing, the reader, a sense for what's coming from your own authority and what is coming from from the tradition or from conventional beliefs that you either haven't studied enough to make a judgment about yourself, or basically that you're not claiming that this is your conviction. That's very helpful for people to hear that. And this brings up, I think, one of the crucial things when you're giving readings. If for those of you who do give readings here, I think it's really important to say to the person that you're talking to, might be a friend or family member, it might be a professional client. Say how you are deriving that conclusion. Just say, okay, you see how you've got this, Mars-Mercury conjunction in your natal chart? Now, Mars has to do with energetic force and a certain ardent act of will that tends to want to propel out of a person. And Mercury has to do with the mind and thinking and communication. And people who have Mars-Mercury conjunctions, and then one might say, like, you know how you had mentioned that you have a tendency to get into arguments, or do you know how while you've been speaking with me today, that you tend to speak with a certain rapidity and a certain force? Well, that's your Mars-Mercury conjunction. So what you've done, you're basically opening up their chart to them so that they become their own priest or priestess of the encounter with the meanings, rather than for you to just say, okay, here's what I see. And then you just tell the conclusions, but you don't tell them how you're deriving them. That keeps the gods behind the veil and makes you the opaque authority. It's kind of like the difference between, in the old days when the priest looked away from the congregation and did their own ritual over here, and compared with having it more as a shared participation in the ritual. Then, if you have, let's say you've seen a certain pattern, and then the next thing to do is to check that pattern. Let's say we're talking about, well, let's say the Mars-Mercury conjunction that I just kind of randomly pulled up. I could say that the reason I am drawing those conclusions is based on simultaneously we have a whole long tradition of understanding Mars representing this particular archetypal principle, the warrior archetype, the energetic force, the physical assertiveness and willful aggressiveness or anger, courage, irritation, all those things that go with Mars. It's a whole long tradition in which thousands of people have contributed to it, and there's a certain coherence to it. And then Mercury has its whole tradition. So on the one hand, this correlation is being grounded in a whole tradition of symbolization that has a certain sustained coherence. But then I look at those, each time I see Mars and Mercury come into alignment, I look at it in people's charts, famous people's charts. I see that, for example, people who tend to be very good debaters, like Nietzsche, or like both of the great presidential debaters who started the debates on television in the last century, John Kennedy and Richard Nixon. They both had Mars-Mercury conjunctions. But then I'll look at, or the famous philosophical debate that happened between Wittgenstein and Popper, both of them with Mars-Mercury conjunctions. Or then you look at the dates of famous debates and see that Mars and Mercury were conjunct in the sky at the time that famous debates happened, like the famous debate between T.H. Huxley and Samuel Wilberforce. And then you look at and this is something that I highly recommend. We're doing, many of you are already in my class that's going on this term that does this, which is you keep careful journals of your own transits week after week, year after year, so that you can look back every time you had Mars conjoining your Mercury in the last 6 years or whatever. You can see, oh, look at the things that happened to me then, and what kinds of experiences did I have, what kind of impulses did I experience, and so forth. And then I'm testing it in multiple categories of evidence. Individual personalities, famous people who are famous, like paradigm figures, and then also people in my personal field that I know and have a sense for. So I'm testing it at that level of natal charts, and I'm testing at the level of transits, of personal transits, and then I'm testing it at the level of world transits, like when a in this case, like a major debate happened or something like that. There's other categories of, you can test it too, like when you bring two people's charts together who are in a relationship, and if one person's Mars is right on the other person's Mercury, you often find a certain tendency for there to be both a speed of verbal interaction and communication, but also a certain force that can tend towards argumentation, argumentativeness. So these are all different ways in which you can be getting a sense for how well does this correlation hold up across the board. In fact, I would say it's good, this is where a good sense of history comes in, to be able to weigh the feeling for to be able to weigh the character of a particular moment in history. You need to know that history fairly well. So having a good sense of history is important. Also, it's really great to study lots of biographies. Personal biographies of individual biographies of people that you admire. Read. If you're into Tolstoy, read the big Tolstoy biographies of Jane Austen or Martin Luther King or whoever it might happen to be, and then study carefully what transits did they have when they went through this powerful experience. What transit did Martin Luther King have when he had that spiritual opening that gave him enough courage to basically put his life on the line from then on in 1956? That kind of really look and carefully. And to history and biography, I would add the arts. And that's why a lot of the courses that I've done here use music or film or comedy. In the case like when John Cleese and I did that course last February and March, we used comic creativity. Each of these is a great way of getting deep into the archetypal meanings, because the arts carry the archetypes directly with a kind of that's why they're so often bigger than life. It's because the archetypes are bigger than life, and they just come through with such vividness. And that points to something that I could say in this room that I don't necessarily say in every context that I might be talking about these matters in. And that is, it's really important to, I think for at least many of us, to get really deeply into the understanding of the archetypes and of the astrological mystery. It requires a certain amount of experience of non-ordinary states of consciousness and deep self-exploration, which could be done with sacred medicine rituals, ayahuasca, LSD, could be spontaneous experiences that emerge in highly focused meditative states. It can be even cannabis can be an extraordinarily, if it's, you're not just blowing it off in, shallow socializing or something like that, which has its place, but there's also ways of using each of these sacred vision plants and cannabis itself in a way to do archetypal meditation, to be able to do active imagination, to be able to tune into, see what you're doing is you're connecting the conscious to the unconscious. That's where art happens, and that's where a deeper astrological grasp of the archetypes comes from that. Some people, like Jungians, focus very much on dreams. So dreams become the way in which the archetypes start to become actual, evidence themselves. For Stan Grof, it was LSD rather than dreams that gave a much more vivid experience of the archetype. For other people, it's the arts. I remember before I began my, psychedelic journeys when I was 20, it was through the arts. I mean, if you see Bergman's Seventh Seal, or you read Moby Dick, or you go to a Shakespeare play, Romeo and Juliet, or Macbeth, or you're seeing the archetypal. When in Othello, you see jealousy, capital J, and it's given this articulate embodiment at an almost divine level, and it's a way of getting a sense for the archetypal. When you see Macbeth, you see ambition, murderous, overpowering ambition, or love, Romeo and Juliet, or whatever it would be. Okay, so there's something about the arts that really carries the archetypal with special directness. And non-ordinary states of consciousness do this in another way, as I sometimes use the metaphor. It's like putting a lightning rod up to the heavens and drawing in the archetypal dimension, and which can shatter the normal egoic control over the veil that happens over reality that keeps things not so intense. But you have to do it in a careful way, disciplined way, safe context, and so forth. I mentioned the importance of studying famous paradigm cases. For example, there's a lot to be said. There's for example, if, let's say, I'm thinking about Pluto, and if Madonna and Nietzsche, if you went to look at their birth charts, and Pluto was not in a prominent place in either of their charts, you'd have to go, there's something wrong with this assumption about the nature of Pluto that I've been working with. If these paradigm cases show no significant presence of Pluto, since they are so vividly embodying the Plutonic principle. The paradigm cases teach us so much. I mean, you can get a lot from the subtle ups and downs of your daily life, but the really dramatic things tell us the most. And if Uranus was not in some major alignment during the 1960s or during the French Revolution, then Uranus can't mean what we are taught that it means. So this is, and conversely though, when you do have a whole tradition of meaning that Uranus means rebellion and the impulse for freedom and the drive for change and creativity and exciting experience and innovation and so forth. And you learn that Pluto has to do with this overpowering force that drives and compels whatever it's touching to titanic dimensions of intensity that can be even destructive as well as kind of highly sexualized and so forth. And then you see that the 1960s had a Uranus-Pluto conjunction in which those two principles were conjoined. Then two things happen. That illuminates the decade, and the decade illuminates the conjunction. And this is the music that astrology can produce, namely the knowing the planetary positions for a particular person or era or transit. That by itself, if you don't know what happened and you just have the planetary positions, it's a highly abstract kind of knowledge, and it's empty in a certain way. But when you bring together the concrete experience, the actual historical event or the actual biographical experience, and you bring that together with the knowledge of the planetary positions, then the concrete events illuminates how you see, oh, that's how that Uranus-Pluto conjunction can work. And at the same time, knowing that conjunction was happening, it shines a light on the event or the experience. It's very much like Kant's point about the concept without the percept is empty, but the percept without the concept is blind. The concept is the archetype, the astrological, the planetary positions. The percept is the concrete event. If you just have the concrete event, but you don't have the astrological pattern that it is embodying, that it fits into, and so forth, then in some sense the event you're blind to the gods that were at work in it. If you just have the astrological information and you don't have what actually happened, or it hasn't happened yet, then that information is in a certain way empty. It hasn't been filled with the well, in quantum physics we would say that the wave function, the probability wave function, has not yet collapsed into a point, into a particle, into the concrete. So the music happens when you bring the two together. And this is why I think by far the most interesting readings are when you're working with somebody who is not testing you to find out whether you can predict what they're like without knowing anything about them. And you can do that, but it's a fairly limited kind of, and that's only helpful for somebody to get over the hump of thinking that there could be any worth to astrology at all. But what's incredibly more fruitful and profound is to have a participatory engagement between you and the person that you're speaking with, so that the two of you explore, using this lens, the reality of their life. And the more that they share with you, the more deep and profound can be the illumination that astrology provides. Study and preserve the anomalies. In other words, the things that don't fit your theory, that don't fit the way you would have expected it to have turned out. You look up the transits and, that's interesting, that's not what I would have expected. If you keep track of those, they're eventually going to teach you something that you didn't know before. Like, oh, I now see these alignments, they really have a bigger orb than I thought. I was trying to fit it all into 3 degrees, and really they have it's a much bigger waveform that is at work. That kind of thing. What I'm saying is we need to have reality teach us the astrology. Don't impose the astrology onto the reality, but instead have that recursive feedback loop so that what the actual teaches us how the gods work rather than vice versa. Test the theory in the light of the data, and then examine. At the same time, you're examining the data in light of the theory, because you need the theory to be able to even configure the data. And then perhaps one of the most crucial things is to, I'll just say about 5 more minutes and then open things up, is to watch for projection. This is where inner psychological work on oneself and inner awareness, self-awareness, self-critical awareness is crucial in pursuing the study of astrology, the practice of it, and the practice of astrological counseling. Because let's take the case of synchronicities. A person who is in an inflated narcissistic state, where they also have a profound need to live not only in a universe of meaning, that is a meaning embedded world rather than a random meaningless one. They not only have that need, they also have the need to have the meaning very much focused on them. They're going to be highly prone towards seeing synchronicities left and right, all over the place. And you see it very often when a person is in a manic state, and they're unrealistically interpreting things all over the place as if they were focused on, as if the universe just had them in mind for why this happened. But that doesn't mean that synchronicities don't happen that are quite meaningfully focused on a person. But to discern which is which requires self-awareness, so that in a sense you're having an I-thou relationship with the world, rather than an I-it relationship where the world becomes a target of your projection, target of your need to be living in a world whose meaning is just focused on you in an inflated or narcissistic way. So it's the same thing with astrology, which is, as Jung suggested the possibility, is synchronicity on a cosmic scale, on a vast systematic scale. We need to have a sufficient self-awareness to recognize when we might be projecting our needs for meaning or our inherited assumptions that we may have taken in from an inadequate study of astrology, and then we're projecting it onto the data. This is also relevant for when you're looking at your own transits. As a practiced astrologer, it's very, very easy to interpret the transits according to the archetypal complex you're dominated by at that moment. Mm-hmm. When, for example, if you're under the influence of a hard Saturn transit, it's very easy to have for you to basically project out into the future the state that you're in. It colors your vision so that as far forward as you can see, it's the same as where you are right now, even though reality is going to keep unfolding and surprising you, and you're going to eventually get you'll click out of the gestalt that you're confined in at any given moment. But Saturn is very convincing in shaping the vision, and at its most extreme, it shapes the vision at its most negative extreme to a no-exit situation where it's never going to get better. And so one has to be very careful of projecting one's fears onto what is otherwise a much more open, multivalent possibility. The same thing is true about wishes, projecting one's wishes as well as one's fears. And this, astrologers have to watch this, because if they, when they're counseling others, people who haven't been, in a sense, come to terms with life in a way, with life and death, with how everything. Well, to use Nietzsche's beautiful phrase, how all pain is birth pain. Until one gets that insight deeply, one is constantly trying to protect oneself and everybody else from in a fearful attitude about the suffering that is necessary for transformation. And so one's readings can be distorted by this phobic response to life. And one can just say, oh, just this Saturn, it's just going to be really bad here. And, or this relationship doesn't have a chance. And that kind of, a lot of it's coming from the limitation of one's own experience of relationships or experience of life, the experience of how going down very deep can actually be crucial to becoming whole. So that's where life experience and inner work on oneself is so important. And that fearful attitude translates also into one of the main ways astrology can be abused, and that is the attempt to micromanage life and control it rather than participate in it. Because the controlling, fearful ego can appropriate anything to serve its manipulative hunger. And astrology provides the vulnerable ego with fantastic ammunition to attempt a micromanaging, obsessive-compulsive attitude towards life. So this is a responsibility, in a sense. It's another form of rigor that is required, a kind of psychological self-awareness to restrain that part of the hyper-vigilant ego that is seeking to control life rather than participate in it. And I think I'll just, I mentioned the importance of not leaping to conclusions about correlative patterns on the basis of insufficient data. That's, of course, a major kind of intellectual rigor that's required in this. Howard Gardner has that book about and teaching about multiple intelligences, and astrology really requires multiple intelligences. It's an intelligence that it's not only, it's of course there's a mathematical dimension, there's an imaginative intelligence that is crucial for archetypal discernment, which we talked about, but there's also a psychological and emotional kind of intelligence, a relational intelligence that's important. I heard the pilot the other day who landed that flight in the Hudson River, Sullenberger, and he was being interviewed by Michael Krasny the other day on Forum, and talked about the need for situational awareness. He said that's the crucial thing that a pilot needs, is situational awareness. It's basically being aware of everything in a given field that is relevant to skillful action. And that's what an astrologer needs, is a kind of situational awareness for judging astrologically a particular phenomenon. And patience, not being willing to basically live in a state of uncertainty without grabbing for a definite, certain, dogmatic interpretation of something, and a certain patience in allowing the universe to reveal its pattern to you, rather than impose your need for the pattern to be there on the world. It's a kind of active receptivity that is required. A kind of active receptivity is the epistemological requirement. And in all these ways, the situational awareness, the multiple intelligence, it reminds me of basically, for those of you who used to enjoy or still do, Sherlock Holmes's the Sherlock Holmes stories that Arthur Conan Doyle wrote. It requires more of the Sherlock Holmes kind of approach rather than the Scotland Yard kind of approach. Scotland Yard is basically trying to do the statistical tests of astrology. Meanwhile, Sherlock Holmes has run circles all around the Scotland Yard and has already identified, what's going on, and because he's drawing on multiple intelligences and has a capacity to go to the heart of the matter using his archetypal discernment. Okay, so those are a few fence posts for discussing the issue of rigor in astrology, and I wonder, would you like to should we take a 5-minute break or something like that, or should we go right into discussion? I'm totally cool with having a little break.
Quick one.
Why don't we take a 5-minute break and then reconvene?